again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, welcome to the first character discussion for Geeky Gentleman Horror Month.
Wahahaha.
Yeah, nah. I need like I have a whole thing that I do every year on Geeky Gentleman History Month. I need to develop something for Horror Month, and I'm going to before we record our next episode. I promise. So anyway, yeah. So we're doing character discussions again for Horror Month. And Ruben has picked our first character. Who are we talking about today, sir?
Today we are talking about Abraham Van Helsing, one of the side characters from the Bram Stoker novel Dracula.
Who has, of course, kind of taken on a life of his own and become a character well outside of Dracula. So I guess what I'm familiar with Van Helsing is kind of just the idea of the monster hunter. Van Helsing's kind of taken on that role, even though that's not at all what he was in the original Bram Stoker novel. But like you've got the Hugh Jackman movie where he's just like this super monster hunter with some kind of mysterious past that didn't get explained in a franchise that didn't happen. And then you've got like other stuff that's portrayed Van Helsing in a very similar light. You've got the Grimm comics, which among making Van Helsing a woman who has just gigantic breasts like everything in Grimm, also does the whole monster hunter aspect. So let me ask you this. Do you like the idea of Van Helsing being the monster hunting badass?
I don't like it going as far as like pretty much like all those things you described. I like him being a little bit more of a hunter than, because like my sister and I have talked about this. She's read the novel and I've read a very condensed. I read the Great Illustrated Classic version when I was a kid, so basically I haven't read the novel. But like she prefers that he just be an old professor who's like very knowledgeable about vampires and their weaknesses. I kind of like the idea that he can be an old man, but he's like kind of grizzled and has seen some stuff and like, you know, has scars and stuff, but he's not like Rambo or anything like that for vampires. I wouldn't go that far, but I kind of like the idea that if he was younger, that he would be like this awesome warrior type who's also like well-read and is a professor.
Mm-hmm. See, for me, I'm kind of in between. I remember Bram Stoker cracking me up because, like, the whole novel's written, is presented kind of in a weird way, like found footage, where it's like all these diary entries and letters and newspaper articles and stuff, and most of Van Helsing's stuff is just like letters that he's writing back and forth with people, and every time he signs off on a letter, which can be really short chapters, every time he signs off on a letter, he puts all his titles, and it's just hilarious because it's like a half page of just titles. It's like PhD, Doctor of Medicine, Philosophy, like just all these fucking things that he has at the end of his title. It always cracked me up. Which he can't do if he's not old.
Right.
And so, like, I don't know. I'm kind of more middle of the road. I like the idea of, like, kind of the stuffy old man who kind of stumbled into vampire slaying with Dracula. And kind of what I've always wanted to do, or wanted to see, and I've never seen anywhere, is for Van Helsing to have kind of been rejected by the intellectual community after his defeat of Dracula. Like let's just, like, Bram Stoker's Dracula is the only thing that's canon, and then there's a Van Helsing series after the fact, in which he's been laughed out of intellectual society for suggesting that not only are there vampires, but he knows how to kill them. but because he's trying really hard to publish all this stuff about what he knows about vampires, that makes him a target from the like creature of the night community.
Yeah.
And so now he's this old ass man that just has to fucking deal with vampires and werewolves and shit now. Is always the direction I've wanted to see done with Van Helsing. It's never happened, and I think it would be really cool to do.
Yeah. I think he there's did you like the movie with Winona Ryder and Gary Oldman?
There's a Winona Ryder and Gary Oldman movie?
Yeah, it's a Dracula movie.
Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, I didn't really care for it either. It's been a while since I've watched it, but I remember not liking it. But what did you think of Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Van Helsing?
I mean, he's good. The actors are not the problem with that movie, except for Keanu Reeves. The problem with that movie is that it says it's Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it's almost nothing like Bram Stoker's Dracula. At a certain point, it gets kind of weird. But no, I think Anthony Hopkins played it pretty straight off the page.
Really?
From what is there of the page, like, because Van Helsing's character isn't the part that's changed. They condense stuff down, which, if you're going to do that, I don't know why you called the movie Bram Stoker's Dracula. But you know what? We've done a review of Bram Stoker's Dracula on Geeky Gentlemen, so if people want to go see that, they can. My wider point just being that I think that, like, Anthony Hopkins is just fine. He seems to be having fun in it at the time.
Yeah, and it's been a while since I've seen the movie, and I have not read the book. Like, if you took the actual complete book and then what I read was probably less than half of it, definitely less than half of it. But Anthony Hopkins seemed almost like a crazy old man who just happened to be right. He just, the way I remember seeing it is like he happens to be just a little bit unhinged, but he's not wrong about all of this, which could go hand in hand with your idea that, like, the academic community kind of rejects him for all these weird theories that he's putting out there.
Well, like, so in the book, and it's been years since I've read it, to be fair, but in the book, he's just a professor of everything. He's just super, super knowledgeable. And so he recognizes, like, he initially goes to inspect Lucy and try to figure out what's wrong with her from a medical perspective. And so he's like, well, she's clearly not got enough blood in her system, so we're going to give her transfusions from all these strong men. And then Dracula keeps revisiting her and draining her every night. And so once he realizes medical treatment isn't working in the book, he begins to pull on some of his knowledge of, like, oral tradition storytelling and mythological creatures and stuff, because he's got a doctorate in that stuff too. And he's like, you're going to think I'm crazy, but we need to put up garlic. And so, like, that was, like, almost a last resort to him, because, like, he reluctantly comes to the idea that it's a vampire, and then his measures actually start to work. So it's like he kind of shocks himself. Whereas if I'm remembering Anthony Hopkins correct, he kind of just shows up. He's like, "Yep, garlic." Mm-hmm. it's kind of weird. Again, there's, like, he's fine. He's kind of doing a kooky thing. That movie's kind of kooky though. But I don't know, like, something appeals to me of the old man who kind of, like, stumbles into it, because usually when we get the monster hunter dynamic, I tend to think of stuff like Supernatural, where they've kind of just always been it. And I don't know, I think that's weird to do with monsters and monster hunters for some reason, because, like, usually the monster has no choice but to be a monster. And I think when you, like, you know, have someone born into a family to become monster hunters and all that stuff, you just kind of make it not their choice whatsoever. It feels weird, and it feels like it's kind of squashing the dynamic and the motivation. Whereas I much prefer the idea that the monster hunter, like gets dragged into it and then just can't get out of that world. Like not only has the world been changed in a horrific way, but now it's been changed because it can never go back to normal.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that dynamic much more interesting.
Yeah. So you don't like the idea, like, you said the character of Van Helsing has gone way beyond just the novel Dracula, but also like there's 500,000 Van Helsing descendants in any horror story ever. Like there's granddaughters in Marvel comics, like with Blade, and there's a granddaughter in DC comics with a character called Night Force, and like there's so many different like B and C level horror movies that have such and such Van Helsing as like carrying on the tradition. So I take it you don't really care for that idea?
No, I don't. And you just reminded me of like one of my favorite little. I think it's like an old Tumblr post where it's like Captain America talking to the Avengers. Is like, all right, is there anything else on the docket? It's like Blade times. I was like, are you guys gonna help me with the vampires? Please, there are like so many. And Captain America goes, no.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't love the idea of like the family tradition of monster hunting that much. I mean, sometimes it works. Like I like the book Predator Hunters, and that's playing with the idea of the monster hunters. But I don't know, like the family dynamic for the hunting of monsters just never really works for me in a huge way. Whereas the idea of just kind of getting dragged into it, I really like. But at the same time, you know what? I really like the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing movie.
Really?
Oh yeah, it's stupid as fuck, but I love it. It really is my favorite on-screen Dracula by a stretch.
I bought that movie for $1 at a yard sale, and I think I paid too much for it. I did not like that movie.
Yeah, it's got my favorite Dracula. It's got by far my favorite werewolf design ever.
Mm-hmm.
I really love the werewolf design in Van Helsing. But that's okay. No, like the Hugh Jackman movie and kind of the portrayal that he has in there is really weird because they do so much to try to set up like this weird background with him. Like, you've probably not seen the movie very many times, I imagine, but like, I don't know if you remember this whole scene where Dracula recognizes Van Helsing, calls him Gabriel, and at one point mentions fighting on the battlefields of Troy together. And it's just like never explained because they wanted to do a franchise and it never turned into a franchise. And so like Van Helsing was like hated by the people because he'd always would kill the monster, and of course right before anyone else could see what he killed, the monster would turn back into a human and all this stuff. And I don't know, that just, as much as I like that movie, that dynamic of Van Helsing is something I never want to see anything else than Van Helsing do.
See, and also that movie is like completely ignoring everything about the novel Dracula. Like it's basically
I mean, sure, but like it's fine because it's doing its own thing.
Right.
It's not calling itself Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Right. I one time, and I think I'm okay with revealing this. I one time considered doing like a webcomic that was like kind of like the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, where it's like all these different vampire stories all happen in the same world, and like show the legacy of these different vampires like into the 20th century. And so you wouldn't like it because my idea was that all of these Van Helsings are like grandchildren and great grandchildren, and they're all cousins, and they've like basically just got this organization spread out across the planet trying to kill vampires. And I really like my idea of Van Helsing, like I said, is like he's been doing it for a little while, and I would probably, if I read the novel Dracula, which I don't know if I ever will, if I read it, I would probably say, okay, this doesn't fit with my idea of Van Helsing. But I had this idea of like he's got an eye patch or whatever, and like he's got like scratches on his chest and stuff just from like doing this for a little while, and like he's a learned man. He's still like a professor and has all these different titles, but he's also been hunting vampires for a little while, and I kind of like that idea. And I want to say I kind of got that idea from, I think I got it from watching the first Bela Lugosi Dracula movie. He may have only been in one now that I think of it, but I feel like it was hinted that him and Van Helsing had kind of encountered each other before the events of that movie. And so I kind of like that idea, but also like there's so many different ways you can play it. And like, there's been a lot of like, Peter Cushing has played Van Helsing several times, or a Van Helsing a few times.
See, I didn't know that. I knew Peter Cushing had been in the Hammer horror films as Victor Frankenstein.
Yeah, and then he was in one of them he played like a grandson of Van Helsing in the present day, but then he's also played, I think, just normal Van Helsing as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I don't know, like Van Helsing's such a weird part because I don't feel like there's a really consistent version of it. Like a lot of it's become the monster hunter with like the long legacy, and I don't like that, so I don't really pay much attention to it. And then a lot of it's just like the one-off. This is his first time encountering a vampire, and there's a lot of ways to read Dracula. There's of course the interpretation of the sexual liberation in the Victorian age and stuff. And that played for horror is all really interesting. But then there's the classic man versus beast, and to its age, to the scientific revolution, Van Helsing beats Dracula with his intelligence. Van Helsing beats Dracula using science, using a scientific method and stuff. And so, like, that is something that's just not played with enough. Dracula is the old world, Van Helsing as the new is a really interesting dynamic that just doesn't get played with to the degree I feel it should. And I don't know, I kind of like things that do that. This isn't Van Helsing, but he might as well be in the movie. Did you ever see the animated The Batman vs. Dracula movie?
Yes, it's been a little while. I'd say it's been like 5 years since I've seen that movie.
Yeah. I don't know, I like that one because Batman uses science to beat Dracula, and that's cool.
Yeah.
And like that's the dynamic that Van Helsing has with Dracula, and of course he's not the only one, but still, that's the dynamic Van Helsing has with Dracula in Bram Stoker's, and it's part of the subtext of the book, and I feel like it was a mistake that we've lost that and just made Van Helsing another, totem carrying, holy water spraying, guy.
Yeah.
Like if you watch the original Bela Lugosi movie, it's even in there. Like he's able to prove that Dracula's a vampire by hiding a mirror somewhere and forcing Dracula to appear, or rather not appear in it, in front of everyone. And this Dracula takes it as like a huge insult, and he's been found out and everything. It's like a really shocking moment in the movie, but it's a scientific moment. Van Helsing notices it, doesn't bring it up, and then recreates it. So he uses, admittedly a flawed, but uses the empirical method to out Dracula. And I don't know, stuff like that's just really cool. It could have been much more grandiose. Like you could play that scene up in a really interesting way, and like have him out Dracula in front of hundreds. That could be a really cool and dramatic way to change up that scene and make it interesting. But whatever. Just things like that. I don't know. It's part of the dynamic that I feel was lost. And I mean, I guess to be fair to the Hugh Jackman movie, he does have kind of like a Bond techie side with a steampunk edge to it in that movie, with like the revolving crossbow. But it's not the same. It's just cool gadgets. It's not the same as like sciencing his way out of the situation.
Yeah, and you're not wrong. Like, I think every single version of Dracula I've seen is just like he's got steaks, he's got holy water, he's got garlic, and like that's really, it seems like, in any of these what we'll call the unofficial Dracula expanded universe, it seems like that's all anyone needs. Like, and they don't use much brain power to fight the vampires. It's just like stab them in the chest and move on. Like I used to really like Buffy, and I don't dislike Buffy now. I just don't like it as much as I used to. But that's all over Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like steak, and that's steak and holy water, and not a whole lot of brains needed, really.
Well, it reminds me of a really good joke in DC Bombshells, because Barbara Gordon Batgirl is actually a vampire in that continuity. And at one point she's like in a fight with the Batgirls of Gotham, and one of them's got a broken bat, and she's like, I'll use and Barbara Gordon like kind of like hops back from it, kind of afraid of it, and she goes, wait, that whole steak thing's actually true? And she looks at her and goes, honey, who wouldn't that kill?
That's great.
Yeah, 40 minutes, the best. But I love that scene. Yeah, the idea of making vampires too easy to kill. And I don't want to like give Bram Stoker too much credit. And it's not like Van Helsing used only science to beat Dracula in the book. There's a lot of myth and stuff, but it's like his research, it's his intellect that beats Dracula. It's not blind faith or anything like that, and so that's just kind of cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've moved away from that. And I don't know. I like the outwitting the monster kind of stories quite a bit.
Yeah. So this has been an enlightening podcast, because I had no idea that anyone liked the Van Helsing movie. Do you like it?
Shade.
Do you like it? Like, do you genuinely think it's good, or do you have like a it's so bad it's good kind of thing with it?
I don't have the so bad it's good reaction. I don't watch it and go, oh my god, this is awful and hilarious. I legit get invested. I legit love it in like a non-ironic way.
Huh.
But I am acknowledging that it is not a good movie.
Oh, okay.
I will fully acknowledge that it has so many problems that it just shouldn't even have. But I still like it. I don't have any real rational explanation for what I like about it, besides that it's just dumb, fun popcorn.
I get that. I may need to give that movie another watch, because it's been a few years since I've...
It's funny, it's been a couple years now, but we did a Geeky Gentleman at one point, and it's not a very good episode because we were like scrambling for people, so it was when Bill was on the show, and we just got one of his friends that I've literally hadn't talked to the dude before, haven't talked to him since, but he was on the show. We did a podcast, and the whole time we're just trying to explain what it is to like about Van Helsing, and we couldn't come up with any argument whatsoever. It's a terrible episode because it's just an hour of like, maybe this thing. No.
That's great.
So no, it's not a good movie. Hugh Jackman's pretty good in it. It's a good performance from Hugh Jackman.
Also, the sidekick, he was the bad guy in Iron Fist season 1.
Oh, well, that's disappointing. He's not had a very glamorous career, has he? I don't know. I love the sidekick in that though. He's like, "But you're a priest." I'm not a priest yet. It was good. It was a good line. It was good. It was fun. Shut up, Ruben.
I'm trying to think of any hidden or like hidden depths to go with Van Helsing. I think you and I kind of we disagree on like and like I said, like there's no wrong way to handle Van Helsing. I feel like everyone has done it differently. Like Anthony Hopkins did it differently than the book, and like every what do I call it? Like not spin-offs, but like every story that says,
every iteration.
Yeah, like there's Dracula, and then there's this other story that's connected to it. Like, spin-offs, I guess, is a good a word as any, but like they all play it a little bit differently, where there's some kind of family lineage going on there.
Yeah, and I don't like that. I don't know. It feels delivered. It feels delivered to the character, which makes it feel less motivating. And then it also just feels like laziness is like, oh, hey, get it? They're connected to Van Helsing, so it's kind of like they're Van Helsing. Yeah, except they're not.
Yeah.
So why does it even matter?
A lot of times it could be literally anyone. Like when you at the end of the Dracula novel, you've got the Harkers, you've got Van Helsing, and then one of their friends survived. So like you could say that like Quincy, was it Quincy who died? I don't remember. It was either Quincy or like you could say like Arthur Holmwood had a kid, and then Arthur was like, "Hey, let me tell you about this time that we killed a vampire," and then like maybe the Holmwoods become like vampire hunters like in 20th century or whatever.
Yeah, it's Van Helsing that figured out how to kill Dracula, so Van Helsing's kind of the one everyone runs with. That, and it's a really cool name.
It is, yeah.
It really is. Van Helsing. You know, it just rolls right off the fucking tongue. So that it just helps. It's got the cool factor. Harker, now. Quincy, hell no. Van Helsing just has a cool sound to it that goes well with Dracula. Yeah, I don't know. The idea of family dynamic doesn't work for me. I'm trying to think if there's like anything that you could do with Van Helsing or anything I've seen done with Van Helsing that I really did like or was okay with and is not the 2004 movie. I'm not connecting.
Yeah, and like I said, like Peter Cushing played at least two different iterations of the character in several movies. He was in a lot of those Hammer horror movies, like you said. He was in the Frankenstein one also. But do you think they could? Because I've seen a few different like classical stories done this way, like the BBC Sherlock series with Benedict Cumberbatch, where they're taking some of the old Sherlock Holmes stories and they're just placing it in the 21st century and trying to change as little as they can. Do you think they could do that with Dracula today?
I mean, they were certainly planning to with Dracula Untold, and then that project kind of died right out the gate because Steve and I were the only two in the world that liked that movie. And I don't know, like, I don't see any reason that you couldn't tell the Dracula story in the modern day and age. I'm sure cell phones would be some kind of inconvenience, but I don't know.
See, like, you could, you mentioned that it's basically a found footage novel. You could do a found footage movie of Dracula, maybe. Like, you know, have the doctor at the insane asylum and, you know, whatever you call it in the 21st century, like doing his report on Renfield or whatever. And like, you could do different stuff like that. I think it'd be interesting. I don't know. It'd be really difficult to do, I think, just because like it's hard to imagine a modern day world where everyone doesn't know about vampires and their lore. So just that itself would be kind of an interesting thing to see. But I don't see that there's any reason you couldn't do it either. But Van Helsing, I think, he'd be a very different kind of character, I think, if you did that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just don't know what you do with Van Helsing in the modern day that's going to make it... Like, I don't know, there's something to the... Do you think it's fair to say there's something to the idea of the classic Universal monsters being in the, you know, late 19th, early 20th century?
I think so. I just because it's kind of like pulp characters like the Shadow or Green Hornet. Like, I feel like they should always be in the 1930s. And like I've seen some people try and modernize those characters, like I read a story I didn't really care for from the 80s that tried to bring Doc Savage into the 80s, and I really didn't like it. I think that I can see someone saying like Dracula, Frankenstein, like those characters should always be in that time. But I also am not opposed to like if you did a story where it's like Dracula somehow survives because he's like this really, like, you know, you've seen movies where it's like this vampire is a class above all the others, like a master vampire or whatever. I think they use that phrase in The Lost Boys. So like if Dracula is like the master vampire of all master vampires and like somehow he survives the novel, and then like what does he do in the 20th century. I like that idea. There's a series of novels called Anno Dracula that kind of explores like it's an alternate history where Dracula didn't die, and he basically he turns the queen into a vampire and then marries her. And each like the first novel is set in the late 1800s. The second novel was set in World War One, and then the third one was set in the 50s. I don't know if that writer. I think there was plans for a fourth one, but I don't remember. But like, I like that idea. But I think trying to remove the history of the character in the late 1800s wouldn't work. I don't think.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I just don't see like part of it's because of how much of the themes like you can bring Dracula into the modern day. You can't bring the Dracula story from Stoker as well into the modern day. It just doesn't work thematically. Like, you lose something because of how much of the themes are tied up to the Victorian age, not only in the ideas of like sexual repression, but again in the idea of scientific advancement. Same with Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a story that doesn't really work once you take the idea of like man challenging nature out of it, and certainly we're still dealing with that, but not in the way that it was fresh and different and unique in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, in a way that it's not now.
Mm-hmm.
We've had like 150 some odd years to deal with the advances of the scientific revolution. We're a little over it.
Yeah.
We have new things to be afraid of, like fascism and technology and fascist technology. There's a new age of things to be scared of that we don't quite understand. So it doesn't, it's not that you can't do it, it's just that it doesn't work as well. Horror and comedy tend to have a relationship that is very much clued in with the times. Like, it's not that something that was written and was funny 100 years ago can't still be funny today, but you probably need to do some homework for the joke to land. And so you gotta question, if you have to do homework for the joke to land, is the joke funny?
Right.
And I think horror's got a very similar thing. And like, you know, there's... It goes in micro eras. Like, there was the era of the slasher. I don't see it coming back. I don't think the slasher... Because that got to arise in a time when, like, people were very afraid of crime.
Mm-hmm.
Crime was on the rise, and the slasher kind of comes around the idea of being the victim of a senseless crime. And it's not like that fear has gone away, but it's not in the public consciousness the way it was. The style of horror that is appealing to has changed. And I don't know, it's a really, really weird discussion to have.
Yeah. So I think you've turned me around on it. Initially, I was saying, like, yeah, you could do a modern take on Dracula in the present day. Now that I'm beginning to say, no, you probably couldn't. Or it wouldn't be as good. Definitely wouldn't be as good.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's a little tangential, but I do think it all connects to Van Helsing and his role in the original story.
Yeah.
Because, I don't know, like, Van Helsing kind of created the thing that now we're just subverting all the time, which is the old scientist guy that thinks he knows everything.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays in all the horror movies, the old scientist guy doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, and he's so arrogant and ignorant, and he just thinks science will always be able to win out the day.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that we've subverted that. Like, Van Helsing created such a trend, such a cliche, that now all we do is subvert it, and so now the original cliche is now the subversion of the new cliche, which was the subversion of the cliche, subversion,
Mm-hmm.
cliche, version, clay, club C. Yeah, that. Anyway, all right. I think that'll do it on Van Helsing. Let's go ahead and go on to recommendations. So I'm gonna go with the original Bram Stoker novel. I say fuck it, watch the Van Helsing movie. It's got stuff in it. It's got a really cool werewolf versus bat monster scene, so that's worth it. And I don't know. Mel Brooks as Van Helsing in Dracula Dead and Loving It is kind of hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
It is about one of the only. It's not the only funny thing in the movie, but it's one of the actual funny things in the movie. So I'll give it that.
I don't have very many recommendations. I would say the Bela Lugosi movie. I think is pretty good. Has a it kind of it leans more towards the old man who has a little bit of experience, but it's not like he's a seasoned vampire hunter. So it's definitely more true to the book from what I understand. So I would go with that, and then I think Peter Cushing kills it. So anytime he plays Van Helsing, you could probably watch that and have a good time with that.
Okay, cool. All right, Ruben, thanks for doing this, man.
All right, not a problem.
All right, everyone. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher,
And I'm the Comics Kid 2099.
and we are your geeky gentlemen, and we will be discussing things.